Welcome friends, welcome back to the kitchen. Welcome back to Sunday morning in the old cookbook show. Today we're going to do a recipe out of this cookbook called Miss Gibbs Cookery Guide. This is a cookbook published in Australia, and I don't have much information about it. I am just starting to collect books from Australia and New Zealand. I find them very interesting because they're from Commonwealth countries. They share the same sort of colonial background as Canada. And a lot of the recipes are very similar to what I find in early Canadian cookbooks. Now, it's undated. It's absolutely undated. And all of my research seems to point to it being published in the 1930s. One of the things that really drives me nuts is when I find these cookbooks and they don't put a date in them. And it's very difficult sometimes to track down dates. If you're a YouTuber out there and you are self-publishing a vanity cookbook, date it. People in the future are going to want to know the date. And that's part of my rant for today. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because Julie and I went to Quebec City last week and saw Rage Against the Machine. It's got me all fired up. So, into the mixer, I put some butter and I'm going to put in some sugar. So, I'm going to cream the two together. Any guesses what we're making? We are making a recipe that is a brownie. Now, let me find it. There is a shift. We've talked about this before. There is a shift in terminology of what a brownie is. In the 1800s, when you see brownie in a North American cookbook, something that I have more experience with, there's no chocolate. Chocolate comes later, and then it's called a chocolate brownie, and then it morphs again into just brownie with chocolate being understood. And if today you gave someone a brownie from the 1800s without chocolate, they'd be disappointed. This is a brownie from an Australian cookbook in 1930, and there's no chocolate. Instead, it's nuts and dates. And so this sort of predates that real use of chocolate all the time. And I'm trying to figure out when that change happens in Australia, because sometimes two recipes called the same thing will coexist. One starts, another one comes in, they coexist, and then one takes over. Chocolate brownies have taken over completely. But I still think there's a lot of value in a recipe like this. We're going to figure out what it tastes like. The butter and sugar is pretty much creamed together, so in goes an egg. Now, the recipe tells me to beat the egg before mixing it in with the butter and sugar, creaming it all together. And there is value in doing that if you're mixing by hand. With the stand mixer, it's not quite as important. It has to do with the way that the egg emulsifies into the butter-sugar mixture. With a stand mixer, you're going to get that emulsification. You're going to get the emulsification faster if you're hand mixing if you beat the egg before you put it in. Recipe I did a couple of weeks ago led me to test this a few times just to see, what the value was. With the stand mixer, there's no value. Just put the eggs straight in. Now, we're going to talk about the flour. Oh wait, let me turn the English side out. It's going to make my point easier. We're going to talk about the flour. Now, the cookbook, it's an Australian cookbook. It calls for self-raising flour with an A. If you live in the United States, you have something called self-rising flour, no A. Most Commonwealth countries call for self-raising flour. Raising, rising, two slightly different ways to get to the same point. They're both flour with a leavening agent, baking soda usually, sometimes baking powder. Throw a little bit of change into the mix. And in the United States, self-rising flour is baking soda and salt added. Whereas in Commonwealth countries, self-raising flour is just flour and baking soda and a little bit more baking soda than you find in the American mixture. And in the Commonwealth mixture, self-raising, no salt. And when I say Commonwealth, I mean Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, all of the nations that were colonized by England. Now, here in Canada, though, recently, it seems, Brownies, this brand here, owned by Robin Hood, and I'm looking at you, Robin Hood, have changed their formula and they now add salt, which just confuses the consumer a little bit. Now there's salt in Canadian self-raising flour. I don't know why they didn't just call it self-rising. Just get it over with, call it what it is. So, I guess my bigger question about that is, as the world globalizes, as giant corporations take over smaller local producers, if you live in Australia or New Zealand, have you noticed, has your self-raising flour changed? Has the formulation changed? Are they adding salt now? I'd like to know. And also, are they using plain flour or cake flour? Here, this is cake and pastry, and I know in the southern U.S., most self-rising flours use a soft flour or a pastry flour or a cake flour. Anyway, these are just questions that I have, and I know that people are watching and love to leave comments about stuff like that, and that's information that I need to know because it makes interpreting recipes out of these old cookbooks easier to do. Long story short, this has salt in it. The recipe doesn't call for any salt, and it doesn't call for self-raising flour with salt, unless maybe in the 1930s, self-raising flour in Australia had salt. Please let me know. So in goes the flour. I'm going to do it a little bit at a time. Don't overwhelm the mixer. Now, calls for hot water and a little bit of baking soda. So obviously the recipe author in this case knew that whatever leavening agent was in the self-raising flour wasn't enough. And I find that kind of interesting. At that point, why call for self-raising flour? Why not just call for flour and the appropriate amount of baking soda? So I'm supposed to put that into hot water. Next into the mixer goes chopped walnuts and chopped dates. And the mixer's slowing down, it's having trouble. So I'm gonna get the water in to help the whole thing along. There we go. The last of the water. Now the recipe tells me to bake this in cake containers, pluralized containers. So I'm imagining that they want me to cook this in smaller cake tins, probably individual portion sizes. I looked through the equipment room and I couldn't really find something that I thought would work. So I'm just using a 9x9, greased with a paper sling in the bottom. I've got the oven preheated to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're gonna bake this off. And you're right, there's no flavoring in this other than maybe whatever flavor the dates might bring to the party. I don't know. There's no vanilla. There's no other essence or flavoring. And this could be a reflection of the time period, 1930. The world is in a Great Depression. Again, though, the Great Depression didn't affect everywhere the same, or at the same time, or the same way. So the economic conditions in Australia and even within Australia, in parts of Australia, may not have been the same as it was in, say, Oklahoma. So I'm not really sure what the reasoning is. I'm not as familiar with Australia as I am with our neighbors just over my shoulder there across the lake. And so there we go, into the oven. Really even distribution of dates and nuts.
What dates in a cake? This must be the old cookbook show.
They're evenly, yes, and they're evenly distributed.
Hi, friends.
I didn't
Hey,
even
Glenn.
have to soak. I didn't even have to coat them in flour.
Woo!
They didn't sink. They don't sink. Anyway, that's for another show. That's for another show. Here you go, little piece of cake. I don't know how I feel about that.
So it has a very distinctly different flavor from most cake. Mm-hmm. Is it all brown sugar?
No.
What gives it that? What is it about it?
I think so there's no flavoring. There's no flavoring.
Oh, that's the original brownie recipe. Mm-hmm. I remember making that years ago.
So I think this is very close to the Fanny Farmer.
Ooh.
Original brownie recipe from the Fanny Farmer cookbook. And I should actually, so I'll throw up on screen. I don't have the book out here.
Okay, you're shaking it around. I can't read it.
I'll dig the book up and I'll throw up a picture of that recipe at the end of the video. There's no flavor to it at all. All of the flavor comes from the dates and a little bit from the nuts, but the cake itself is just plain. Completely plain. And I think it really comes down to, it's not overly sweet. It's something that you would have with a cup of tea in the afternoon. It's one of those things where sometimes you have a piece of cake and you think afterwards, maybe I shouldn't have had that piece of cake. I don't think you'd have that same feeling with this. You would enjoy it with something else.
No, I kind of like it.
Yeah.
It's not super sweet.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yes, like there's no surprise. We tend not to ice things.
Yeah. So this is,
So those, yeah, it's not cloyingly sweet.
it's not cloyingly sweet. It's not spongy and moist like some cakes. It is a stout cake. It's solid. It's a stout cake.
But it's funny because I couldn't quite put my finger on the flavor. It's like,
Yeah.
is it brown sugar? But there's no sugar, so I still can't quite figure out
It's just coming
what
from
it
the
is.
dates.
But it's lovely.
Yeah.
See, I'm gonna eat more. I have a
And
problem.
I will eat more too. I don't. It's not a bad cake. It's just not what I expected. And now that I think about it, I kind of enjoy it. But
What
I know
were you
that it's not.
expecting though? Were you expecting something like really bland?
I had expected it to be much more bland than that.
Huh.
Yes.
So it was a good surprise then.
Yeah. Yeah. So, 1930s brownie recipe from an Australian cookbook that may resemble a brownie recipe from an American cookbook from the late 1800s.
There you go.
We'll find out, or you'll find out in a moment. Thanks for stopping by. See you again soon.